When we talk about China and climate change, the story we usually hear seems pretty simple, right? It's the world's biggest emitter, and it's still building coal plants. But what if I told you that story is already out of date? Today, we're going to go deep into the data, way past the headlines, to really understand what might be the single, most massive, and rapid energy transition in human history. We're going to look at the official vision, the absolutely breathtaking speed of the change, and yeah, the very real cost of this transformation. So here's our roadmap. We'll start with a historic turning point that just happened with China's emissions. Then we'll break down the official game plan and the incredible speed of how it's all playing out. We're going to tackle that big, confusing coal paradox, and then we'll dig into a fascinating academic study to see the real economic trade-offs. From there, we'll look at how this whole revolution is spreading to the toughest parts of the economy, and then finally, we'll pull it all together into this powerful new idea, the rise of the world's first electrostate. All right, let's dive right in, because something has just happened that really changes the entire global climate conversation. For years, the big question has always been, when will China's emissions finally peak? But maybe a much better question now is the fight already being won? Now I know, that sounds like a pretty wild question, especially given everything we hear. But the latest data suggests we are at a genuine inflection point, a moment where a trend that's been going for decades has finally and decisively reversed. This chart right here is the whole story. It shows that in early 2024, China's CO2 emissions started to fall. And the critical part here is why. This isn't because of some economic crisis or a pandemic lockdown. This is happening even as electricity demand is growing like crazy. This isn't some temporary dip, you see. It's a structural break from the past, and it's being driven entirely by one thing, the explosive growth of clean energy. For the very first time, the amount of new clean power being installed, we're talking solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, it's so massive that it's now covering more than all of China's new electricity demand. Think about that. In the first few months of 2024, clean energy was enough to meet over 100% of demand growth. This means renewables aren't just adding to the grid anymore, they are now actively kicking fossil fuels off the grid at scale. So a historic shift like this doesn't just happen by accident. Nope, it's the result of a very clear national strategy being put into action at a speed and a scale that is, frankly, almost impossible to wrap your head around. So what's the vision, and just how insane is the velocity? Okay, so the official game plan is called the dual carbon vision. The goals are pretty straightforward. First, peak CO2 emissions sometime before 2030. Second, hit full carbon neutrality before 2060. And just recently, they added a new checkpoint, a goal to cut all greenhouse gas emissions by 7 to 10% from their peak by 2035. This is the top-down framework that's driving everything. And you can see that framework in action right here. In the first 4 months of 2024, a staggering 89% of all new power added to China's grid was solar and wind. I mean, just look at that. It's an overwhelming all-in bet on renewables. The data doesn't lie. The decline of coal is happening. Now let's talk about speed. To really get a feel for the velocity, you have to look at the numbers. In just the first 4 months of 2024, China added 105 gigawatts of new solar. That's up 75% from the same time last year. It is more than 8 times more than all the new thermal power plants combined. The pace isn't just fast, it's literally accelerating. But gigawatts can feel a little abstract, so let's put it this way. In the single month of April 2024, China installed 45.2 gigawatts of solar. That is more solar capacity than the entire continent of Australia has built in its entire history. 1 month versus decades of development. That is the kind of velocity we are talking about. And it's not just about making the power, it's about making it reliable. So what about when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing? Well, to solve that classic problem, China is on a massive build-out of energy storage. The national target for 2025 was 30 gigawatts. They blew past that and had already installed 78 gigawatts by the end of 2024. That's nearly triple the target. Projections now show they are on track to install well over 200 gigawatts by 2030. This is a full systems-level approach. Okay, so the numbers on renewables are just staggering. But this brings us to the big question, the thing that confuses just about everyone in the West. It's the point we always hear in the headlines. What about all the new coal plants? This is the great China coal paradox. right? If renewables are growing this fast, why on earth is China still permitting and building new coal plants? It seems like a total contradiction. But the answer lies in a really fundamental strategic shift in what that coal is actually being used for. Coal's job on the Chinese grid is changing. Historically, coal was baseload. It was the workhorse that ran 24/7 to keep the lights on. But its new role is as a backstop. It's becoming an insurance policy, designed to kick in only when the renewables dip, just to prevent blackouts and keep the whole system stable. And we can actually see this shift happening in the numbers. The utilization rate, which is basically just the percentage of time a power plant is actually turned on and making electricity, for the average coal plant in China, just hit a record low of 46.4%. So even as they add new plants, the fleet as a whole is running less than half the time. They're being used as backups, not workhorses. Now, as you can imagine, this creates a lot of uncertainty, even for the top experts. This is a survey of dozens of energy specialists, and you can see a clear split. The number of experts who think China's coal use has already peaked has jumped from 15% to 44% in just 2 years. But an almost equal number, 43%, think it hasn't peaked yet. So while the long-term decline seems inevitable, the exact timing is still up for debate, precisely because of this complex new role coal is playing. But a transformation this huge, the largest infrastructure project in the world, doesn't come for free. It's a massive engine of change, but that engine has costs. It creates some pretty significant economic trade-offs, and to understand them, we're going to look at the findings from a recent, really detailed academic study. First, we just need one little concept from the paper: Green Total Factor Productivity, or GTFP. Don't worry about the name. Just think of it as a way to measure good economic growth. Growth that's not just big, but also efficient and sustainable. The core finding from the research is a classic economic idea called crowding out. The absolutely enormous amount of money needed to build all this new energy infrastructure has to come from somewhere. And the study found this spending is crowding out government money from other really critical fields. It's a calculated sacrifice, trading short-term investment in some areas for long-term energy security and a dominant position in green tech. And the data from the study is just incredible. When researchers looked at the budgets of local governments that were implementing these energy policies, they found that while total spending didn't really change, spending on science and technology, or S&T, dropped by a massive 40.53%. To pay for the energy transition, funding for research and innovation is being squeezed. That is a huge and often hidden cost of this transformation. And this economic burden isn't even shared equally across the country. The paper reveals this fascinating north-south divide. Southern China is way more mountainous, which makes it far more expensive to build all the huge power lines they need. And as a result, that crowding out effect is significantly bigger in the southern provinces, meaning their S&T budgets are getting hit even harder to pay for all that difficult construction. So far, we've mostly talked about the power sector, but to get to carbon neutral, you have to go way beyond that. So let's look at the next frontier, the heavy-hitting industrial sectors like steel and cement, and of course, transportation. These are usually seen as the hardest nuts to crack. And yet, there's a really strong consensus among experts that a turning point is here. According to a 2024 survey, about 80% of specialists believe that emissions from China's steel and cement industries, which are the number 2 and 3 sources of CO2, have either already peaked or will do so before 2030. That suggests even these industrial behemoths are being reshaped by this transition. Now, this chart tracks expert opinion on transport emissions, and it's pretty amazing. Go back to 2022, and only about 23% of them thought transport emissions would peak before 2030. But look at 2024. That number has skyrocketed to 60%. The optimism has exploded, and it's for one main reason: the unbelievable speed of vehicle electrification and the adoption of what China calls new energy vehicles, or NEVs. And this isn't just wishful thinking. This is now being baked into official government policy. China's Ministry of Transport recently issued new rules to speed up the move. The goals are ambitious. Get to a 10% share of electricity in all transport energy use by 2027, and have a fully clean, low-carbon transport system by 2035. The switch from fossil fuels to electrons is becoming the law of the land. Okay, so this brings us to our final section, where we pull all these different threads together: the emissions drop, the grand strategy, the velocity, the costs, the move into new sectors, and we weave them into one big concluding idea. Because what we're witnessing here isn't just an energy transition. It's the fundamental rewiring of an entire economy and the creation of something brand new. This chart right here shows you everything. It tracks how much of a country's final energy comes from electricity. For decades, you see the US and Europe just flatlined at around 22%. But look at China's line since the mid-2010s. It is on a steep upward curve, rapidly recentering its entire economy around electricity. This is what's leading analysts to call it the world's first major electrostate.
And you have to understand, the reason for this goes way beyond just climate goals. As Tim Buckley from Climate Energy Finance points out, this is also about geopolitics and national security. By electrifying its economy with clean energy it makes itself, China dramatically cuts its dependence on imported fossil fuels, which are always subject to volatile prices and geopolitical drama. It's a strategy for total energy independence.
So the big takeaway is this. We need to reframe how we see this entire story. This is not just about swapping some coal plants for solar panels. This is a fundamental economic transformation. It's about building a whole new kind of economy, one that's not only powered by clean electricity, but is also driven by the very clean technologies, from batteries to EVs to wind turbines, that China is now manufacturing at a globally dominant scale. And this leaves us with one final provocative question. This transition is happening. The speed and scale are undeniable, and the economic and geopolitical logic behind it is powerful. The train has left the station. The race is on. So the question is no longer if this will happen, but how will the rest of the world adapt to, compete with, and cooperate with China's emerging electric-powered future?